Pemberton stood in her perfectly manicured driveway at 6:47 a.m., screaming at a 17-year-old landscaper about the precise angle of her neighbor's sprinkler overspray. This is a violation of Section 4.27 of our HOA covenant, she shrieked, waving a laminated rulebook like a battle flag. The boy dropped his leaf blower and ran. 30 minutes later, she was chasing down Mrs. Chen's garbage truck with a measuring tape, hollering that the trash bins were exactly 3 inches too far from the curb. Stop! Municipal violation in Puro Juries. The driver, thinking she was having a medical emergency, called 911. By 8:15 a.m., Karen had already filed 6 noise complaints, 2 landscaping violations, and 1 aggressive bird feeding incident against the Hendersons' grandchildren. She stood triumphant in her kitchen, sipping organic kale smoothie from her world's best HOA president mug, when her phone buzzed with the news that would change everything. Emergency HOA board meeting tonight. Read the text from Vice President Janet Morrison. Motion to remove you as president. We need to talk. Karen's smoothie glass shattered against her Italian marble backsplash. For 3 years, Karen had ruled Willowbrook Estates with an iron fist wrapped in regulation. She'd implemented 27 new rules, from mandating specific shades of beige for mailboxes to requiring written permits for birthday parties. Her crowning achievement was the Aesthetic Harmony Ordinance, a 40-page document that regulated everything from the height of garden gnomes to the acceptable species of flowering plants. But now, whispers of rebellion had reached even her loyal supporters. The Henderson incident last month, where she'd called the police on their 8-year-old's chalk art, had finally pushed the community too far. Janet, we need to discuss this privately, Karen said when Morrison answered her call. There's nothing to discuss, Karen. The votes are in. 7-2. This is about the Rodriguez family, isn't it? Because I reported their unapproved fence stain? Karen, you had their power shut off over fence stain. It was mahogany mist. The approved color is rustic oak. The line went dead. Karen paced her immaculate living room, her mind racing. Everything she'd built, every rule she'd carefully crafted, every perfectly ordered aspect of Willowbrook Estates, it was all crumbling because people couldn't follow simple guidelines. She'd dedicated her life to this community after her divorce. Harold had called her controlling and impossible to live with, but Harold was weak. These neighbors were weak too. They needed structure, discipline, order. They needed her. By noon, Karen had formulated her plan. If they wanted to remove her as president, fine. But they'd learn what Willowbrook Estates looked like without her protection. They'd beg for her return. She started with the water. Karen had discovered months ago that the community's main water line ran directly through her backyard, a fact she kept carefully hidden. Armed with her late father's construction tools and a YouTube tutorial, she began excavating. If they thought Mrs. Rodriguez's slightly off-color fence was a problem, wait until they dealt with mysteriously fluctuating water pressure during the dinner hour. Accidental pipeline maintenance, she'd call it. Next came the Boulder. The massive limestone rock had been sitting at the entrance of Willowbrook Estates for 12 years, a tasteful accent to their monument sign. But Karen knew something the others didn't. It wasn't anchored. A few strategic adjustments with a crowbar, and the next heavy rain would send it rolling directly into the street, blocking the main entrance. The fire would be trickier, but Karen was nothing if not resourceful. As evening approached and the emergency meeting drew near, Karen stood at her kitchen window, watching her neighbors gathered in the community center across the street. She could see their animated gestures through the windows, their righteous indignation. Let them have their little rebellion. Tomorrow, when their perfectly ordered world began to crumble, they'd remember why they needed her. Karen smiled, picked up her father's old kerosene lantern, and headed for the utility shed behind the community center. After all, sometimes a neighborhood needed to burn before it could be rebuilt properly. The next morning brought chaos that even Karen hadn't anticipated. At 5:43 a.m., the boulder had indeed rolled, but not into the street as planned. Instead, It had crashed through the Williamses' living room window, demolishing their antique piano and sending 80-year-old Mr. Williams to the emergency room with chest pains from the shock. Karen stood in her bathrobe, watching paramedics load her neighbor into an ambulance, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine remorse. This wasn't supposed to happen. The boulder was meant to inconvenience, not injure. Karen, Janet Morrison stormed across the street, still in her pajamas. The water pressure is completely gone in half the neighborhood. There's raw sewage backing up into the Chen's basement. And now this. What did you do? I don't know what you're talking about, Karen said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. By 8 a.m., 3 more disasters had unfolded. The community center's electrical system had mysteriously failed during the night. Apparently, an old kerosene lantern had been left burning too close to some exposed wiring. The building hadn't burned down, thankfully, but the damage would cost thousands to repair. Insurance investigators were already asking questions. Worse, Karen's sabotage of the water line had created a domino effect. The pressure drop had caused the main valve to malfunction, flooding the street and washing out the foundation of the playground where children gathered every afternoon. Standing in her kitchen, watching her neighbors wade through ankle-deep water to rescue photo albums and furniture, Karen felt the weight of what she'd done. These weren't just names on HOA violation notices anymore. They were people whose lives she just turned upside down. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on her door at noon, holding her sobbing toddler. Karen, I know we've had our differences about the fence, but my basement is flooded and my husband's medical equipment is ruined. Could we possibly store some things in your garage until the water recedes? Looking into the woman's desperate eyes, Karen realized she'd become the very thing she'd always claimed to fight against, a threat to the community's well-being. Of course, Karen whispered, "Bring whatever you need." Over the next 3 days, something extraordinary happened. As neighbors helped neighbors, as insurance claims were filed and repair crews arrived, Karen found herself not issuing citations or measuring fence heights, but actually helping. She organized meal schedules for displaced families. She used her obsessive documentation skills to help residents navigate insurance paperwork. She even drove Mr. Williams to his follow-up appointments. "You know," Janet Morrison said on Thursday afternoon, as they sorted donated clothes for the Chen family, "you're actually pretty good at this community organizing thing when you're not, well, being a complete tyrant," Karen supplied. "I was going to say measuring mailbox heights, but sure." Friday evening, the community gathered for an impromptu meeting in Karen's living room, the only space still available after the community center damage. The mood was different now. Serious, but not angry. "We need to talk about what happened," said Tom Henderson, the father of the chalk-art criminal. "And we need to talk about moving forward." Karen took a deep breath. "I sabotaged the water line and the boulder, and I left that lantern at the community center." The room fell silent. "I was angry about losing the presidency, and I wanted to prove you all needed me. Instead, I nearly killed Mr. Williams and destroyed half our neighborhood." "Why are you telling us this?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "Because you deserve the truth, and because—" Karen paused, looking around at these people she'd spent 3 years battling. "Because I finally understand what community actually means." Tom Henderson leaned forward. "The question is, what do we do now?" "We rebuild," said Janet Morrison. "All of us, together, including me?" Karen asked quietly. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Mr. Williams, still pale but insistent on attending despite his wife's protests, spoke up. "Karen, you've got organizational skills this community needs. The question is whether you can use them to help instead of control." "I'd like to try," Karen said, "if you'll let me." As the meeting wound down and neighbors filtered out into the muggy evening, Karen stood alone in her pristine kitchen, looking out at the destruction she'd caused. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, not just repairing the physical damage, but rebuilding the trust she'd shattered. But for the first time in years, Karen Pemberton felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. And in her mailbox, she'd later find an anonymous note. "Some secrets have deeper consequences than water damage. We need to meet, soon." The signature was just a single initial, H.